I'm not talking about 80s rock or Plymouth rock, not even the rock, but I'm talking about installing and painting rocks on your model railroad scenery on Ron's Trains and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and if you'd like to see more model railroad tips, tools, and techniques, then be sure and subscribe down below and click the little bell icon so you can catch future videos. Whether you're building just a single module or an entire basement empire, you're going to need scenery for your model railroad, and chances are that scenery is going to include some rocks. That means you're going to need to do some rock casting, and ultimately you're going to have to paint those rocks. And whether you have just a few rock castings or entire mountains covered with rocks, you're going to want to paint them in a way that's going to look realistic. It's going to draw people's eye. It's going to make them naturally think that is what rocks should look like. Well, in a previous video, I showed you how I changed some scenic forms to improve a particular scene near Wichita Falls and the transition from Texas to the mountains on my layout. In that video, I showed you how I was installing some rock castings along the Wichita River. Well, today we're going to be blending those rock castings into the scenery, and we're going to be painting them in such a way as to make them look realistic, to make them look natural, and as though they fit in the terrain in the particular area that I'm modeling. Do you have some suggestions about how you paint your rock castings? Tell us about your processes in the comments section down below. Now I'm going to take you over to that portion of the layout and show you how I blended and painted my rocks as I continue to build this scene. I've mixed up a nice big batch of Sculpting Mold. Now this is not the ground goop that I used before. This is Sculpting Mold, which is a paper mache material that has plaster in it. So this will set and get hard, but it has a nice long working time is the beauty of it. And I mixed this up. Sculpting Mold is normally white. I just shot a little bit of tan craft paint into it to give it some color so that I don't have that white down underneath. And I'm going to be using the Sculpting Mold to fill in along the bank area underneath these rocks, as well as to do this bank area over here. I'll probably cover all of this foam a little bit with Sculpting Mold. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little gap in here between this foam and the piece of plywood here that makes up Wichita Falls Yard. So I'm going to be smoothing all of that in. And so I'm going to be working on that first. And then once I get that all in place and it sets up, we're going to come back and paint all of these rock castings, which is going to be the primary part of our video for today. there you have it. I think that has that in pretty good shape. what I'm doing around the rock area here, that's thin enough that it should dry pretty quickly, and I think we'll be ready to go on and do some painting of our rocks, maybe by in the morning. Okay, I've come back now, and I said I was going to let this set overnight. In fact, I've actually let this set for about a week, and not because it needed to, just because I haven't gotten back to it. Today, I'm going to be putting on the base coat of paint for the rocks, and these rocks, the Wichita River, North Texas, everything has a little bit of a red tint to it, so we're going to work on that, but it's still basically a gray rock with just some red tint. There are a couple of different ways of approaching painting rocks. Some people like to start with a very dark, even black, and completely coat all of the rocks so that they can fill in all of the crevices and get all those shadow areas, and then come back with lighter paint and go over it. And that works good for some people. I sometimes find it's hard for me to lighten the very dark rock, so I like to go the opposite direction. I like to start light and then come and fill in the shadow areas and darken as I go. But knowing that I'm going to be darkening with stains later, I actually want to start with colors that are lighter than what I know that I want, because I know that they're going to darken as I add other paint to them. So I'm starting off today with just some gray craft paint. This is called a slate gray. It's a little lighter than what I would think of slate gray as being. But this is just inexpensive craft paint like you can buy at Walmart for 50 cents to $1 a bottle. I have added a little water to this to thin it down. I don't want to wash, but I do want it thin enough that it can get into all of those little crevices. So I mix this about 1 part water to probably 5 parts paint, something like that. Just thinned it a little bit so I can get it into these areas. I want to make sure I coat this good, though, because I do have this one rock that had come from a previous layout that has previously been painted. So I want to make sure that I get a good base coat that's going to make these pretty well match each other. So I've got just a 1/2 inch artist's brush here, and then I've also got a small round brush for getting into some of the smaller areas. And I'm going to just come and start working at the top. I'm going to do this left-handed for a little bit, just so you can better see what I'm doing. I'm going to be real careful around my backdrop and areas. I'm not really concerned if I get some of this gray paint up onto this ground area. You know, that's just kind of where the rocks would blend into the ground there. And any part that I don't want to be rock is ultimately going to get covered with soil and other scenery material later down the road. So as you see, I'm just working this in. I want to get a good coverage on my rocks. I want to make sure that it gets down into all those little crevices. And one thing I'm going to have to really work at doing, and I hope I can keep my hand out of the way, and that is you've got to make sure that you get up underneath rocks so that you can get into all those little crevices underneath. Invariably, if you miss a spot, it'll be a spot where somebody will be able to get to and see in a way and at a time that you didn't expect. And all of a sudden, hey, look, there's some white standing out like a sore thumb from my otherwise beautifully painted rocks. So try to make sure that I get down underneath, and I'm painting this on, but I'm also kind of stippling it into those nooks and crannies and crevices, just to make sure everything gets really filled. Whenever you're done with this, a great way to make sure that you've got it right is to come back and take some photographs of it using a camera with a flash from all kinds of different angles. Because if there is any white that shows up anywhere, a camera, and especially a camera with a flash, will show it up. And so that's what I usually do. I'll come back after I'm done with this particular step and take some photographs with my camera with a flash after it's completely dry. And you know, I try to get down low angles where I'm looking up, and just all kinds of different angles. Take photographs with flash, and then look and see, hey, do I see any white standing out? Because it will reflect the light from that flash. And there is that base coat. Now again, the plaster will take a lot of the liquid out of this base coat and it will dry fairly quickly. But I do need it to be completely dry before I go on to the next step. Now that our light gray base coat has had plenty of time to dry, I'm ready to come back and start applying some washes to make this rock a little more interesting. And so what I've done is I've taken some burnt umber craft paint and mixed it in even amounts, 50-50, with some white craft paint. And what that yields is kind of a beigey pink color. And then that paint, I mixed about 1 part of that mixed paint with 10 parts water, and I came up with a wash that looks like this. Again, this is not a color you might look at and think of, oh yeah, that's the color I want for rocks. But bear with me as we go through this process. I think this is going to produce the effect that I want once we're finished. So kind of this pinky color that the burnt umber produces when mixed with the white, and I'm just going to put a wash on the entire rock face here. My goal is not to paint the rock face, and my goal is also not necessarily to force it into all the crevices. We'll worry about that later. This I want just some to get on the surface and stay on the surface, but in a wash kind of a way. Now when I'm working with washes, I have a paper towel down here because there's a lot of water in this, a lot of moisture, a lot of it's going to run off, and so my paper towel will soak it up. And so I'm just going to come in, I'm just going to start dabbing this on the surfaces and then let it run down over the faces and down to the bottom. I don't have to completely coat everything. We want to have kind of a mottled effect. And again, my goal here is not to paint the rocks, to completely cover up the gray. This is just going to add some color, some of that reddish color onto the face of the gray. Now, remember, this is not the last step, so whatever this looks like is not what it's going to look like whenever it's finished. This is just one of several layers of color that we're going to be adding here. I want some of the gray to shine through, to come through. I want some of that gray to remain in there, but I want to definitely get some of that pinkish reddish color into the rocks. Make sure I get these 2 small rocks over here as well. Got a lot there. That's why I've got my paper towel to soak some of that up. And you see a lot of this is running down here, and I just use my paper towel to kind of keep the bulk of that picked up. But I think that's getting the idea right there. I'm going to add just a little more in spots. I don't want to overdo this red. I can overdo this and it can come out looking cartoonish, and that is not at all what I want. Just again to get a little bit of the red color in there. Now again, we're working with washes here, and my next step is going to be a wash as well. And so, you know, washes, because they're thin, doesn't take too much to wash them away. So we want to make sure this has time, again, to completely dry before we come back with our next step. I see a couple spots where I've got a little bit kind of pooling up, and I'm going to just take my brush. I've kind of dried my brush off on my paper towel. I'm just going to soak up, if I've got bits where it's kind of pooling up, I don't want it to pool. And come back and just kind of soak some of those spots up a little bit. Now that my raw umber wash has had plenty of time to completely dry, we're going to come back with our next step. For this step, we want to give some relief to all of the texture of the rocks, and we want to put shadows in the crevices, kind of give that sunshine and shadow look. And to do that, I'm going to use a wash of India ink and alcohol. You can buy India ink at about any art supply store, Hobby Lobby, Michael's. You can get it on Amazon, I believe. And what I do is depending on how strong you make your India ink wash, will make a difference as to how much of it sticks in the crevices. And I don't like to have to do this wash more than once. But on the other hand, I also don't want it to darken my rocks too much each time. So I put 1 teaspoon of India ink in a pint of 70% isopropyl alcohol. And you see here in this little bowl, I've got just a little bit of that mixture. And I use one of these little foam brushes to apply it. And I just keep the same one. I squeeze all the ink out of it each time, mixture, and save it just for this purpose. And in this case, we just want to squeeze this on and let it wash down over all of our rocks. We want everything to get covered. We want to make sure it gets into all the little nooks and crannies and crevices. We don't want too much to sit just on the surface for too long. Now I know as I do this, it's making that look all very, very dark. That's going to change as it continues to run down, as it dries. It's going to darken the rocks some, but it's not going to darken them quite as much as it looks like it is right there. But this is going to give us a lot of relief, really bring out all of that texture. Going to make a lot of shadows in these rocks. Then after I've got it all applied, I'm going to squeeze all the ink that I can out of my little foam brush here. I'm going to use my paper towel to soak this up. Now this is going to kind of stain my ground down here at the bottom a little bit, but again, that's okay. We're going to do a lot of painting and other stuff on that later. But you can also clearly see why you want to do this coloring of the rocks, and especially this step right here, before you do much in the way of other ground cover or other scenery down below it, because this always runs down. There's no way to keep it from that. Now, I've squeezed the ink out of my brush, so I'm going to go, you can see some of these flat areas, it's just pooling up and catching a lot of it, and I don't want to leave those big pools. Still have some ink in that. Okay, squeezing the ink out. Now I'm going to come back and just use the brush to kind of soak up some of those pools. I don't want to get all the ink out. I could use a paper towel for this, but a dry paper towel is going to wick it out really fast. That's going to take all the ink out. I don't want to do that. I just want to take some of the ink out of those areas where it's kind of pooling up. So I'll use the brush, which is damp, with the India ink solution, but there's enough of it squeezed out that I can make a difference. All right, now I think you're going to really notice a difference between what this looks like now and then what it looks like when it's dry. Now that my India ink has had a chance to dry, I'm ready for what should be the last step in this process. Now, you never know just for sure exactly how these washes are going to interact with a particular rock casting. And you can see, you know, of the rock castings I have here, it acted a little differently on all of them. This rock casting has a lot of texture to it, and a lot of the black really kind of settled into some of the texture on the surface, which is not really what I was going for, but I think this next step we can tone that down and change that a lot. You see on some of these other small rock castings here, the black really settled into the nooks and crannies and crevices. That's really what the effect that I was going for here. But what I do like is the fact that I can still see the gray, so I still got that limestone look. You can still see some of that reddish brown peeking through, which I definitely wanted. And then the black has kind of toned that down. Now for our last step, we're going to add some sun highlights, and in doing so, we'll hopefully tone a lot of that black down. To do this, I'm using some white paint, just that same white craft paint that I used before. And you see I've got just a drop of it here, just a little spot, a few drops in this mixing palette. I also have a little scrap of cardboard here because we're going to be dry brushing. And for dry brushing, if you're not familiar, if you haven't done that before, you want a fairly stiff bristled brush. It really works the best. And I'm going to get my my white paint here and get a little bit of paint on my paintbrush. And then I'm going to come over here to this piece of cardboard, and I'm just going to brush most of that off. I just want to have a trace amount of paint on there. I don't want to paint these rocks white. I just want to hit the edges of them where the sun would be hitting them and kind of highlight them. And so to do that, because again, we're thinking about sun highlights, sun is going to be shining down, so I'm going to do all of my brushing in downward strokes for the most part. And I'm going to come on just gently at first, because you don't want to overdo this. And just make some downward strokes. You can see a little bit of that starting to rub off there. Again, you want to build this up very slowly. You get too much white paint on all at once, and you're going to be scrambling for something to wipe it off because you know that's not going to look right. I don't want to work the white down into the nooks and crannies and crevices. Those are areas where shadows would be, and I want to keep the darker colors in those shadowy areas. There we go. As you see, those white highlights really toned down some of that black that was kind of sitting on the surface, and at the same time kind of highlights some of the black that's down in the crevices. You get the dark colors in the crevices, the little bit of highlight on the very top, the gray and the reddish colors kind of in between, and it really brings out the highlights and the texture of the rock. I especially like the way these little rocks down here came out. They're really my favorite of this whole particular set of rock castings, because you really can see the dark in the crevices, and the highlights really just give that nice kind of granite or limestone kind of a look. So that's one of the methods that I use for coloring rocks. Now the method can vary a lot depending on the color of rock, the kind of rock that you're trying to model. But for this area and for these rocks, I think this came out looking pretty good. And I think as you look at it from the front of the layout, looking down this river, I think it's going to make a very convincing scene. So those are some techniques that you can try as you are producing rocks for your layout. And I hope you'll let me know how that goes. Well, I think these rock castings are turning out pretty well as I compare them to the prototype photos of rocks in the particular area that I'm modeling. As you work on casting and painting rocks for your layout, be sure and gather some prototype photos of the area of the country or the part of the world that you're modeling. Compare the colors, compare the styles of rocks and the strata so that you can get just the right rock mold and just the right colors that will look realistic and convincing as you build the scenery on your model railroad layout. Well, before I close today, I want to encourage you to go check out the Modeler's Journal. It's an online digital magazine free of charge and dedicated to modelers and model building. I happen to write a column for that magazine called the Modeler's Workbench, and in it I elaborate on some of the very same types of topics that I cover here on my YouTube channel. In addition to my column, there are tons of other articles and columns about model building, about model railroading, and of interest to modelers in general. So go check it out at themodelersjournal.com. There's a link to that website in the description down below. I think that you'll really enjoy it. The subscription is free, so go check it out. Also, while you're getting that link from the description, be sure and check out my Amazon page and especially my Amazon Pick of the Week, as well as those links to where you can connect with me on Instagram, Facebook, and other social media. Well, be sure and join me again next Tuesday as I'll be bringing you another great model railroad video, and I look forward to seeing you then. Lizzie?